Welcome to today's program. It's titled Women for Change, Gender Equality in the Carter Administration from the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. And it is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project. So the Presidential Primary Sources Project is a partnership between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. And it is a free interactive educational program we put on from January through April. And this is just a reminder that by participating in the webinar, you agree to be recorded, streamed, broadcasted, and archived as part of the program series. And we do have copies of all of our presentations on our YouTube channel, so you can go there to find all of our past programs from the years. And we will continue to put these, So we're so excited to have you all here today. We're looking like we got a great crowd so far, and we want you to participate as much as possible. So the main way we're going to participate today is by using the chat box. Looks like a little chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. And with that, we just want to make sure we keep all of our comments on topic and relevant to what the presenter is talking about. And if you would like to be put on video, you can drop that in the chat and I can put you as a panelist in the webinar, and that way you can kind of wave at us, or we can see you guys. Another way you can change your participation is if you'd like to be renamed, you can rename yourself. We always recommend that so that you're being called something you'd like to be called. And if you need help with that, you can also put that in the chat, and I can help you out with that as well. Thanks again so much for joining us today. If you'd like to find our past program archive or register for more programs, here's our website. And with that, I will pass it over to Josh.
Thank you so much, Casey. It's great to be here with everybody. Just bear with me a moment while I get my screen shared. It's going to take a moment. Okay, and are we seeing my screen fine there, Casey? All right, very good. Okay, so it's great to be here again. My name is Joshua Montanari. I'm the education specialist at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. We are a unit of the National Archives and Records Administration. So our program today is called Women for a Change, Gender Equality and the Carter Administration. Just so you know what we're going to be going over, we'll talk a little bit about the 1976 presidential campaign. We'll talk about what Jimmy Carter does as president, trying to make changes for women in the United States. We'll talk about his administration's support for the Equal Rights Amendment. And then we'll talk a little bit about running on the change that he's made in his bid for re-election in the 1980 presidential election. Now, as we go through this, as I always tell my students, I'm not here to tell you what to think, what to believe about history. I'm here to just help you be your own historian, make up your own mind based on the primary sources that we share with you. The National Archives has these great document analysis sheets you can get off of their website. They have them for every type of primary source, but generally the formula doesn't change for them. And I'd like you to keep this formula in mind as we go through the presentation today, as I'll be sharing primary sources in most of my slides. But basically meet the document, the primary source, observe its parts, and the last two are the big ones. Make sense of it, and what historical evidence can you get out of that? What is it telling us about our nation's history? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'll start by asking a question, and we see a great primary source there. This was the first design for the Great Seal of the United States of America, a little different than the one we have now, but this was our first one. And we see that Latin motto on a banner in the eagle's mouth, E pluribus unum, which translates to out of many one. So go in the chat and just maybe put some comments. How has that motto, out of many one, guided our political, social, or economic change over time? Or, what are the indications of it when we look at our history? Do we see that being honored? Are there contradictions in there? Go ahead and just drop a couple lines in the chat. And if Casey could be so kind to say some of those out loud for me, so I know what you're writing.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got many states, one country from Creek House School.
Many states, yeah. We start off as 13 colonies. We unite into one nation. I like to think about technological advancements, things like the railroad going west, kind of democratizing travel, for all Americans, but then what are the implications maybe on indigenous people in North America after that? Just one example that comes to mind.
Different people from different countries come to America to form one.
Right, very good. It's a great perspective. Think about how do we make changes to our Constitution? Is that something done unilaterally by Congress or the president?
We also have from Alfred Elementary School, 5th grade. Out of many people, one stands out like our president.
Okay, very good. A president is elected to represent us. We vote and we have that one voice, that one representative for us. Very good. Okay, that's great. These are some really good answers. Um, and thank you for anyone else who might have some more. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide where we talk about 1976 presidential campaign. We can see Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed there in 1976. Now, we want to look at where the country was at that time. At that time, we have Gerald Ford as our president. He becomes president after Richard Nixon resigns from the White House. He's the only president to be running for re-election when he was never elected president or vice president, because he was appointed vice president under Nixon after Spiro Agnew had resigned. So it's a very unique set of circumstances. But we can just look at this photograph, maybe get a little indication about the involvement of women in the government at that time. They're not completely out of it. Maybe it doesn't look like we have any on the National Security Council, which is what we're seeing in this photograph. This is after the fall of Saigon in Vietnam, and Ford has called together his National Security Council to discuss what's happening. There are about 12% of the government is accounted for as female appointees in the Ford administration, so they aren't completely shut out. He does have a cabinet secretary, Carla Hales of Housing and Urban Development. He is in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, as is his wife, Betty Ford. He does approve the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. So that we can see a little clue that there was some unequal credit opportunity in the United States at that time. Fact of the matter was that if you were a female, you had to have a male co-applicant to apply for credit, whether that was personal or if you're trying to start a business. So Ford changes that. So we see some progress. And he does also sign a proclamation on Women's Equality Day in 1974. Now you're seeing some highlighted blue text there. Those are hyperlinks. Following the program, I'll provide a PDF version of this presentation to Casey, and she can distribute it to anyone who's in attendance today. And you can delve a little further into that on your own time. So he's making some changes, but Ford doesn't really seem to be running on social change. We see a artifact on the left, a campaign button from the 1976 campaign. Happy Days are here again. Ford Z. In case you don't know, there's a show called Happy Days, kind of a throwback to the 1950s. And Ford's face has been put on the main character, Fonzie, there. On the right, Jimmy Carter, maybe a little looser. He's hanging out with the Allman Brothers backstage before a show, would also make appearances with Willie Nelson, was in contact with Bob Dylan. So maybe a little more on the hip side of things than going back to the 1950s. So you can kind of see a visible difference there when we look at these primary sources. And to see how that election turned out, so we have some statistical data on the left, a little bit of visual on the right. So they actually capture an equal percentage of each gender, respectively, in that election. Carter gets 52% of both the male and female vote. When we look at the bar graph, that translated to 21 million men voting for him, 23.72 million women. Ford got 48% of each, and we see those numbers there. It's electoral college victory of 297 to 240, which is relatively close and marginal as far as that's concerned. Women were 52% of the total voter turnout, with a cumulative 45.62 million votes cast. Not sure exactly why that is. Many people might think that because of the fallout from the Watergate scandal and the Nixon administration, maybe disillusionment with the Vietnam War, which had just ended in 1975, maybe more men were turned off from voting. We don't know exactly why that was. And then just an interesting statistic that um, altogether, when we count the numbers, more people voted in 1976, but voter turnout was down 10% from 1964. So that tells you we had a lot more people register to vote. And even though we had the highest number, the percentage of that higher number uh, was lower overall than in the previous decade. So Carter wins election to the White House. Now it's time to put into action what he's been campaigning about. As we see him taking the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol building on January 20th, 1977. We see his wife, Rosalind, between him and Supreme Court Justice, former President Ford to the standing behind the Supreme Court Justice administering the oath. And just to touch base with the Constitution, that is our supreme law of the land, to give us a little civics integration here. What Constitution-based solutions were available to President Carter, or any president for that matter, to address gender equality? Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution outlines how we go about passing congressional legislation, which is subject to approval or veto by the president. So if Congress passes something, he's got it within his power to approve it or send it back to them and make some changes. He can institute executive actions through Article 2, Section 1. These generally powers not relegated to other branches nor explicitly denied to the president. Now, executive actions don't quite take the place of congressional legislation. Usually an executive action is facilitating something in the Constitution or a law that's been passed. For instance, if there is a law passed saying we want to reduce greenhouse gases by 50% in our country, an executive action would be President Carter appointing a task force to figure out how we're going to reduce greenhouse gases by 50%, if that makes sense to everybody. The president can also make presidential appointments through Article 2, Section 2. So ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, federal judges, the Supreme Court, other officers in the United States. And we do have the checks and balances in our Constitution. Those have to be confirmed by the United States Senate, the legislative branch. But those are all areas where the president has a direct role in addressing an issue like gender equality. So one action we see, there's a photograph from the National Archives. Carter creates the task force on women business owners. He does appoint prominent women in business to his administration. For example, Juanita Krebs, we'll mention her later. The number of businesses owned by women rises from 1.9 million in 1977 to 2.5 million in 1980, a more than 33.4% gain. And the context I get, particularly from what we talked about in the Ford administration, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, is that we see this change happening across administrations. Seldom any accomplishment of any presidential administration is solely within the doings of that administration. Usually things that were happening in the previous one are going into effect later on. Sometimes presidents are picking up and continuing work on an issue and so on as it goes with the next president. But we see the impacts of that Equal Credit Opportunity Act coming to fruition in the Carter administration. Again, building on the work of Gerald Ford, Carter expands membership of the National Commission on the Observance of the International Women's Year from 35 members to 45 members. So he brings in additional perspectives on women's issues in the United States. And that's done through an executive order that he signs in March of 1977. Upon expiration of its congressional statute, Carter does create the advisory committee of the International Women's Year. So really just renewing it, maybe giving it a slightly different name, something relatively common. in our government, presidents trying to put their own spin on something, maybe even getting to claim all the credit of something that somebody else did. Fairly common in our history, but we see this primary source of President Carter directly engaging with that group there in the White House. Another executive order, he created the Interdepartmental Task Force, which was designed to promote equality for American women by ensuring that the needs of women are recognized and incorporated into federal policies and programs. Again, seeing how executive action works, again, not taking the place of congressional legislation or an amendment to the Constitution. We can see how his administration was publicizing the work that this task force was doing on the right side there. We see a picture of a woman in the center. That is Sarah Weddington. That is who he appointed as the head of this task force. And the Carter Library does have all the volumes of the White House News on Women in our collection. So that's something, if you want to learn more about, go to our website, complete an Ask an Archivist form, and they can help you get access to more of these. Now here's some, again, within the powers of the president to appoint public ministers. President Carter appoints Midge Costanza as assistant to the president for public liaison. Again, reaching out to women in the business community. He appoints Juanita Krebs, Secretary of Commerce. I believe she rises to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I believe worked with IBM as well. Then we have Patricia Roberts Harris. She is Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, later becomes Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. So the first woman to serve in 2 cabinet positions in the Carter administration. And it should be noted the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare does evolve in the Carter administration because they do create the Department of Education. So that changes during that administration. But again, using the powers of the Constitution to put female faces in the government, this visible changes that voters can tangibly see. But a really big area where Carter increases the participation of women in the government is in the federal judiciary. In fact, Carter appoints more women to federal judgeships than all 38 previous administrations. So let that sink in a minute. More women in the federal judiciary than all 38 previous administrations. One that we see here goes on to be a little more famous in the federal judiciary. We see Ruth Bader Ginsburg here being appointed as a federal judge. She is later nominated by President Bill Clinton to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States, and she does get approved for that role, which she serves for multiple decades. Again, on the left, we see a primary source of the Carter administration trying to put out the word that they are increasing involvement of women, what exactly they're doing to make that happen. Again, great stuff in our collection. Please reach out to us to find some more. In 1977, the National Women's Conference is held in Houston, Texas. Notable attendees, First Ladies Rosalind Carter, Betty Ford, Lady Bird Johnson. Declaration of American Women is read aloud by famed poet Maya Angelou. Again, I have a link to the hyperlink to that. You can explore further on your own. And this culminates in a very comprehensive report called The Spirit of Houston. But we have a great photograph there of that. We can maybe see the energy that was there, the optimism that was going on. In the front, we see Rosalind Carter in the green dress, Betty Ford in the blue, and Lady Bird Johnson is in that red dress there, we see to the right. Again, legislating change, like President Ford had the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. At that time in our nation's history, if you were a woman and you became pregnant, that could be grounds for termination from employment. I suppose that's because it is gender roles, traditional gender roles are assumed. If you're a pregnant mother, you're obviously going to have to be home caring for your children, taking care of them. There's no way a husband could be doing that or sharing in that. So how could you be working and holding down a job and doing that at the same time? Well, the Carter administration changes that. Congress passes the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. President Carter signs it into law. And really, the way this works is it's an amendment to Title VII of a previous law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When we tend to think more of that with voting, well, we have an amendment to include the fact that women cannot be fired for getting pregnant. So that's a big step. So we'll talk about the Carter administration's support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, amendment to the Constitution. This is something that went across multiple administrations, supported by the Ford administration, also by the Carter administration. Have a great primary source there, some young people publicizing where they're going. It looks like they're leaving Seneca Falls, New York, traveling to Houston, Texas to the International Women's Conference that we were previously speaking about. Now, in my mind, when I think of momentous changes in our nation's history, big events happening, as far as they go on paper, I always think it's going to be some huge volume and a big tall stack of papers. You are looking at the Equal Rights Amendment. There's these two simple paragraphs here, but it's important to look at the wording of things. As we look at the first paragraph and we look at the last sentence there, that the following article is proposed to the Constitution be ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission by Congress. So this creates a little complexity to this, because there is nothing in the Constitution whatsoever that puts a time limit on an amendment to the Constitution. There's nothing saying that you can't do it either. It's one of those vague areas. Maybe the forefathers thought we've got a lot on our plate. Maybe some leaders down the road will figure that out and bring some clarification to that. Seems to be a case in a lot of issues. But really, the amendment itself is that second paragraph, 3 sections, each one a sentence. Really, section 1, that first sentence is the meat of it. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Again, that could be interpreted a few ways, but that's the language that the states are going to be voting on, is that part from article down below those 3 sections. And just a little refresher on what it takes to get a constitutional amendment passed. A proposal must pass by 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, or 2/3 of our 50 states can hold conventions and approve a proposal. After one or the other of those happens, then we need 3/4 or 75% or 38 of our 50 states to vote to ratify that in both of their houses in their state legislatures. So not just a single vote, much like the federal government, we have a House of Representatives, Senate. It differs state to state, but generally bicameral. Both need to approve that. And we'll see how those results turn out. We talked about that 7 years. That 7 years comes and goes. There was a Supreme Court case in 1921, Dillon versus Gloss, where the Supreme Court did decide that Congress can impose a deadline on an amendment, given that there's nothing saying they can't. Now that creates some complexity, because we saw that paragraph about the 7 years, then we see the article itself. Well, when it gets sent to the states, they don't have that top paragraph in it. They just have the article itself. There's no mention of a 7-year deadline when the states themselves are voting on it in their legislatures. So that creates a little bit of legal wiggle room for the Carter administration. They take a page out of from what the Supreme Court said. If there's nothing saying they can't extend a deadline. So that's what they do. Carter, we see in the photograph here, extending that deadline from March of 79 to June of 1982, because at that point they have 35 out of 38 states that they need. They need 3 more to get it to the finish line. Now, this is kind of text heavy, So I'll just sit back for a minute and let everybody read over this. So this is Jimmy Carter putting out a public statement of why he thinks Americans and their representatives in their state legislatures should support the Equal Rights Amendment. See a couple highlights in the fourth paragraph, last sentence. We do see that Carter says the only way to achieve full legal equality for women is to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, because laws affecting women could be changed easily to reduce current safeguards. He also mentions the last 6 presidents have advocated the Equal Rights Amendment. Congress has voiced its support for the Equal Rights Amendment twice. Both the Democratic and Republican parties support the amendment, and widespread support by a substantial number of Americans. See, today the United States proudly speaks out on behalf of human rights for all the people of the world, and we must be no less vigilant in our defense of human rights at home. And that was a common theme in the Carter administration. Okay, again, you'll have access to this presentation following the program today, and I highly implore you to look further into this statement by President Jimmy Carter. So we're going to go ahead and move on. Again, support from the First Lady. Jimmy Carter still maintains that Rosalind is his most trusted advisor. You can find numerous photographs in the Carter Library's collection of the First Lady being in cabinet meetings with Jimmy Carter, something we don't typically see in United States history. But we see Rosalind Carter here speaking at a public event for the Equal Rights Amendment. This is at the National Women's Conference. Again, we can see Betty Ford to the right there with the white collar, dark blue dress. Again, doing her part, advocating. And again, it's a great reminder that there's nothing in the Constitution that says the partner of the president has to do anything at all. Rosalind Carter was a very active and vocal First Lady, and in addition to advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment, she was also a champion for mental health awareness, and still continues that today at the Carter Center here in Atlanta. But we'd like to talk about the other side of the argument to bring some balance here, the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. We have 2 lucrative primary sources here. On the left, a letter from Phyllis Schlafly, who was a chairman of the Stop ERA group. Now, this is written to the Ford administration. We see it specifically addressed to Miss Lind. But the second paragraph is really showing that what the point she wants to get across, that she has a daughter who will be 18 years old. Can you tell her how she can be assured that her personal liberties not to be required to register for the draft, which are presently guaranteed under the Selective Service Law, will not be abridged by the Equal Rights Amendment? On the right, we can see another member of that organization at the National Women's Conference in 1977. So it wasn't just a huge celebration of people and everyone in agreement that the Equal Rights Amendment should be passed. We have a significant presence of women opposing the Equal Rights Amendment. And to just go over some of those concerns again, concerns are women would be required to register for selective service. Technically, the Selective Service Act, it's a law, it's legislation, can be modified at any time if Congress and the president are in agreement. A little known fact that when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, 1980, Jimmy Carter does consider asking Congress to modify the Selective Service Act to include women because he fears it's the tinderbox that's going to lead to World War III, and that women would be needed in one role or another in our armed forces. Never comes to that, but it's considered. So we don't need an amendment for that to happen. It can happen by legislation. That is not to say that if the Equal Rights Amendment doesn't pass, or if it does pass, that women would not automatically be included. We don't know because it hasn't gone into effect, so therefore it didn't get challenged. There were certain labor law protections for women that they felt could be questioned. At that time, the right to alimony during separation and divorce typically was assumed to be granted for women, and all along with the tendency to win custody of children in divorce cases. So all of these things were legitimate fears that women did have, that these things could be taken away from them if they were deemed fully equal in the eyes of the law with men. The Carter continues advocating throughout his administration for this amendment to pass. We see there's a great statement from him showing that evidence of his support and enthusiasm and optimism for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. He's ending with, "Our course is a proper one, our time is right, and I predict that next year we will win. I'm determined to do so if you'll help me." So here's an interesting map that we can maybe take a minute to digest. As I mentioned, the results of the Equal Right Amendment is very complex. I think more so than any other proposed amendment in our nation's history. The writing might be a little small in the bottom right in the key there. So all the green states you see on the map ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, both houses of their state legislatures. The states in yellow didn't ratify it at all in either house of their legislatures. That's Utah, Arizona, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. The light blue colored states ratified it in one house of their legislature, meaning one or the other did not. So only partial passage. The red states, Idaho, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kentucky, and Tennessee, ratified it and then chose to revoke ratification. Again, something that the Constitution doesn't say you can or can't do, so they went ahead and did it. And that happened before that 1982 deadline. A few orange states, Nevada, Illinois, Virginia, ratified it after the 1982 deadline, with the legal argument that the Constitution never says that you can put a deadline on it, despite the Supreme Court ruling you could. They're kind of ignoring that, I guess you could say. And then that one purple state, North Dakota, ratified and then revoked it after that 1982 deadline. So the Equal Rights Amendment did not make it to the finish line. At its peak, it had 35 out of 38 states supporting that. But many, again, legally would argue with the debate over time limit, that you could still go off of the states that approved it and get a few more states to vote for it today, and it could come to passage. But a question to pose to everybody: to legislate or amend our state or federal laws an adequate substitute for a constitutional amendment? Are there advantages or disadvantages of each option? So if we want to go ahead and get in the chat there, anyone's perspective is welcome on these. Think about a state law or a federal law, how they are passed, how they're put into effect. Think about a constitutional amendment, the Constitution being the supreme law of the land that any subsequent laws passed by Congress, signed by the president, have to respect and have to be aligned with.
To jump in really quick, we also had a question for the last slide that was what
Okay.
does Delaware do? Because they look like they're a little bit gray.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Delaware is a light blue colored state. So they ratified only one house of their legislature. Good call. Sorry to miss you there, Delaware. Anybody have any comments on whether they think states can pass laws or the federal government can pass laws and that's enough on an issue such as gender equality?
Looks like Natalie said laws can be overturned easier than an amendment.
That's right, they can. It just takes maybe a change in a majority in those state legislatures, a new legislature or new governor, if they're in agreement, can come in and roll back a law, or if something's been in place to, let's say, prohibit gender equality, they can come in and pass new laws to provide it. So what happens if I live in Virginia and my legislature passes laws for gender equality, and then I travel to Georgia where they haven't? Does that maybe make things a little confusing, a little complex? Yeah, probably. Maybe the same is said, for federal laws, as we mentioned with states, that you can pass a federal law and next Congress and president perhaps could have a different opinion. Do we have anything else in the chat?
Yeah, we've got Miles said constitutional amendment will be a stronger protection.
Right. Because again, if you wanted to change that, you would have to go through that amendment process again. Any other thoughts? It's okay if you know where you're at on this. Maybe it's self-evident or a popular phrase. Okay, so let's see. Getting to 1980, so now President Carter has been in office. Unlike before, where he's talking about what he would do as president, now he is, like any candidate running for a re-election, is talking about what they have done and still what they could do in a second term. But we have a real powerful primary source on the right. We can see the female presidential appointees in the Carter administration. Um, and if there's a notable one, if we go from the third row up from the bottom, fourth from the right, a name that you might recognize, Hillary Rodham. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Does anyone know her with a different name, perhaps? Or a modified name, we could say?
Yes, Miles says Hillary Clinton.
There we go. So Hillary Clinton, so she would go on, and she had worked in a previous presidential administration, had worked on other presidential campaigns in the Republican Party. She goes on to be First Lady of the United States, initially married to Governor Bill Clinton, then becomes president. She then becomes Senator Hillary Clinton from the state of New York, then Secretary of State Clinton in the Obama administration. So much like Ruth Bader Ginsburg gets a start there and goes on to bigger things later on. So here's some excerpts, and again, this is kind of statistical, from the Carter administration making their case for what they've done for women in public office. So feel free to go ahead and gloss over some of these statistics that we see there. I think we've seen a lot of changes even from then today. Again, a big one, federal judiciary. At that time, no woman had served on the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 4 women Court of Appeals judges out of 97, 14 women district court judges out of 417. So even with all that Carter's appointed, still numbers are relatively low. It seems like, I would think from a woman's perspective, there's a lot of room for growth. But we do see a big impact at the local level. We look at state legislatures, the number of women serving there throughout the country more than doubled between 1969 and 1979, from 4.1% to 10.3%. So there's some tangible progress. Statewide elective and cabinet offices, again, increasing a little bit from 10.3% when just before Carter comes into office, 10.7%. So a little bump right there. I'll go ahead and just show some more statistics. Let's see. State judiciary, again, we see some good numbers there. Local office, again, 1977, 9,930 women composed 7.8% of officials at the local level compared to 5,931 in 1975. So we do see women really getting engaged at the local level, state level. And I think that will build eventually towards the federal level. But Carter appoints 21% of his staff as women, compared to 12%, as we mentioned, in the Ford administration. So that's a significant jump of 9% of government officials. More are now female. Again, in the U.S. cabinet, he was the first president to have two women cabinet members simultaneously, Juanita Krebs and Patricia Harris. And then again, Patricia Harris goes on to serve in two different cabinet roles. And altogether, women in May of 1979 represent 8 to 10% of elected office holders nationwide, compared to 4 to 6% in 1975 before his time in office. So we do see some very significant numbers that the Carter administration can advocate and boast about in regards to promoting gender equality in the federal, not just in the federal government, but having that trickle down to state offices and local offices. And then also, again, campaign commercials. His 1976 election campaign, again, a little bit more pop culture. Now he's got that record to run on, and he does have, he is directly appealing to women on his record when he's running in 1980. So I'll go ahead and play a couple short commercials just to give you an idea. On the left, we have, a lot of younger folks might not recognize her, but Mary Tyler Moore from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I'll go ahead and play that clip. A nice retro countdown there.
I'm Mary Tyler Moore, and I'm here to talk to women for a minute. But men are more than welcome to listen to. And please don't take my advice just because I'm a familiar face. This is something you'll have to think out for yourself. President Carter's attitude toward the women of America is clear and constructive and forward-looking, and his attitude is reflected in action. He's appointed more women to high-level jobs than any president in history. He's been consistently in favor of any legislation that would give women equal rights. Nearly half this country's women now work outside their homes, as I do. In fact, we've become a nation of two-job families. And President Carter wants our women to be able to cut through the years of disdain and delay to get the guarantees in the home and in the world that they need. This isn't a one-issue election, of course, but men and women truly concerned about women's freedom are going to vote for President Jimmy Carter. I know I am.
Join Mary Tyler Moore in re-electing President Carter.
We can see Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale aren't quite as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as they were in the 76 campaign. They look a little tired now in the 1980 campaign. Okay, I'll go ahead and play a second one. Retro countdown.
There are more and more women who are in the same position that I am in, and I think it's very important that a woman be able to support her family, because it's happening more every day that's a necessity.
Carol Quick is one of 26 million American women for whom work is a necessity.
Well, I don't see myself as a militant at all. I just see myself as a supporter of my family. I think that President Carter has definitely made an awareness of women for the nation, and he's done many things that I feel are for working women. I mean, a lot of women are married and work and are contributing to their family, and I think they deserve equal rights as well. This is why I support President Carter, because I personally feel like he supports me.
Interesting visualizations in that last video. We see a woman maybe defying traditional gender roles. Now she is leaving and working as a nurse, something we might traditionally see women in, but we also see her playing baseball with the son, doing the homework with the son. Maybe those are things at that time we had thought men would be doing those. But I think the Carter campaign was showing this is what we're about, showing that we're kind of redefining traditional gender roles, showing that women can do these things that men do, and men could do things that women did. Okay, there we go. Next slide. And so again, just this is a document from the Carter Library's collections. This was the Carter administration putting out what their record was, why they felt they should be reelected in 1980. When we think about, in regards to women, equal rights protection, the extension of the ERA ratification deadline, appointment of more Blacks, Hispanics, and women to cabinet, sub-cabinet, and White House positions, and other senior management positions than any other president. And again, that really big statistic that more Blacks, Hispanics, and women than all previous 38 presidents combined. And a notably tripling of federal purchases for minority-owned businesses. And so we'll conclude on this question here. And again, we're open to all perspectives on here. There's no right or wrong answer. This is just what you think. This is you being your own historian from your own experiences and from maybe some of the primary sources we've shared today. So go ahead and jump in the chat. Do you think it is important for people serving in our government to reflect our nation's diversity? Why or why not? So go ahead and jump in the chat, either way you see it.
Got one yes so far.
Okay, yes, lots of different perspectives. Okay, that's a great way to look at that. Coming from different walks of life, different circumstances. Anybody else have a thought on that and a reason why? Because it helps our nation. Okay. Thanks for putting that out there. Here's one. It doesn't matter because gender or race doesn't matter as long as they do the right thing. There's an interesting perspective. I would say, hey, we've got old white Jimmy Carter, man in the White House. He made this big impact. He wasn't a woman. So there's an argument to be made there. Someone says we need diversity and our country needs to reflect on it because we might not have enough at the moment. Okay, someone's bringing it up to today's government. Okay. Yes, because they get a say in how things are. Right, because when we look at the Ford administration with passing that Equal Credit Protection Act, someone at some point decided without women having a say that they're not allowed to apply for credit on their own. Didn't have a say in it, really impacted them. And we see when they got that right, those women-owned businesses really started booming. See, we think it's important for people who know what they are and what they are doing instead of based on diversity. Okay, so again, saying maybe it doesn't matter so much as long as they're doing the right thing and advocating for those people in our society, different segments. Someone else says yes, because when they look back, they learn what went well and what didn't and how to make better choices for the future. Right, so, again, I'll go back to that Equal Credit Act. Maybe from a business perspective, we saw a great potential to grow the economy if we let women apply for their own lines of credit and open their own businesses. That could help it, especially in the 1970s when we had inflation, we had high unemployment at the time. That could have been a big help to try to combat that. Great. Wow, really a lot of great input here, and especially having it come from both perspectives, from different perspectives. I really like that. So, sometimes we get all of one when I do these programs. It's great to see contrasting views and civil discourse. Anybody else have anything there? Okay, we're at 15 minutes. So tell you what, let me go to And so just to let you know, again, we'll be sharing this presentation with you, but we do have a lot of other places for further inquiry, because something to note about any primary source you come across, if you're doing a project for school, National History Day submission, no primary source should have all the answers. If it does, it's probably not a primary source. It's probably a secondary source. So you should always be prompted to have further inquiry from a good primary source. Again, one of the ones I shared, the record of Jimmy Carter in the Carter Library collection, also within the National Archives, records of the Office of the Assistant to the President for Women's Affairs, records of Ann Wexler, Special Assistant to the President, opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. We have files on that at the Carter Library, again, balancing perspectives. And another great one to go to is the Ford Presidential Library up in Michigan. They have a lot of great digitized holdings related to women's rights. And if you go to one of the National Archives' great websites called docsteach.org, you can find an education activity for grades 8 through 12 called the Equal. I'm sorry, that's my apologies. This is on the Carter Library website, Equal Rights Amendment and an education activity for grades 8 through 12, and you can access a PDF of that and use in your class or at home. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and looks like we have a little bit of time if anybody has any questions or would just like to discuss anything in relation to our program today. So the floor is all yours, everybody.
I did see some questions from earlier.
Okay, great.
So there's one I thought would be a great question to cover, that was, what have President and Mrs. Carter done since leaving office to further women's rights?
So President and Mrs. Carter have been extremely active since leaving office. In 1982, they formed a group called the Carter Center. In fact, there are the Carter Library's neighbors. We share our campus with them here in Atlanta. So they've been hard at work with the Carter Center since 1982. They further peace negotiations around the world if there's a conflict happening, election monitoring, eradication of diseases, but really the overall focus is on human rights. And I think the most tangible way we could see that is in elections around the world, ensuring that if there is that, if people are registered to vote, they're not being intimidated, they're not being suppressed, they're being able to get out to the polls, to have their voice heard, to be a part of the civic process in their nation. And they still do that to this very day. In fact, the Carter Center is pivoting a little bit. They're also getting involved in elections in our own nation now. And that was a change they made during the pandemic, but still continuing their efforts overseas. Rosalind Carter has advocated for caregivers as well as mental health awareness, which can affects both men and women. So that's another area where they've been advocating. But overall, I would just say human rights in general, which I think the point of the Equal Rights Amendment was that we're humans. We're not men, not women. We're all just human beings. We should be seen equally. Great question. And I think what it tells us, the work they've done, something to remember you can apply to other areas of your life. Just because you're not president and first lady anymore doesn't mean you can't still be a leader for our country and the world. And translate as you will. You're not the teacher, you can help your classmates with work. You're not the coach, you can help a teammate. You're not the parent, but you can help around the house. Applies to a lot of areas of our lives. I think they're great post-White House role models.
I love that. I asked you the question that says, do presidents get to pick the location of their library?
Yes, presidents do get to pick that. In fact, presidents get to pick whether or not they're going to have a public-facing library or not. It's completely up to them. Again, nothing in the Constitution says they have to. So the first presidential library was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His predecessor, Herbert Hoover, then decided he wanted one. Now, the way it's traditionally worked is if they decide they're going to have a public-facing institution like Jimmy Carter has here in Atlanta, they have to go out and raise all the money they need to purchase the land and construct the facilities. Then what typically happens, the management is handed over to the National Archives and Records Administration. We do see that changing a little bit. The Obama Library will be privately run by his foundation. That had also been done initially by the Nixon Presidential Library. They were privately run, then decided they would have the National Archives manage. Now, regardless of whether or not they choose to have that museum you can go and visit in person, all of their records that the National Archives holds, and that's written documents, photographs, audio recordings, video, maps, posters, artwork, whatever it is that's created by their administration, is managed by the National Archives and Records Administration and is technically referred to as a presidential library, even if it's not a brick and mortar institution, so to speak. And you can go online now, and there is a website for the Donald Trump Presidential Library. President Trump has not yet decided if he's going to have a museum we can go visit, but the collection of his records with the National Archives is designated as a presidential library, so to speak. Did that answer the question? Did I get off on too much of a historical tangent there?
I think that definitely answered it. But
Okay,
let's see
good.
if the question asked for- Perfect. There's another question that's did President Carter's daughter have any effect on his views?
Did President Carter's daughter have his effect? So yeah, he had a daughter, Amy Carter. She's a little younger than her big brothers. President Carter said she was a 12-year negotiation with Roosevelt, so she came a little later. She was really the last White House child to really be in the full media spotlight. I mean, they used to have to take a lot of great pains to get her to school on time. She attended a public school in Washington, D.C. when she lived there, and usually they had to make their way through throngs and mobs of reporters. She was actually involved in his presidential campaigns. I know one popular photograph we have in our exhibits is her at a Crystal fast food restaurant holding a referendum with kids on who they would vote for the president. But yeah, I think that I know there's a statement from President Carter, it might have been in that letter that I showed, that he wanted his daughter to grow up in a world where she was equal to everybody else and have the same opportunities as everyone else. So I think she definitely did have an impact on his views.
Awesome. I think that's most of the questions. We've got some little comments in the chat.
Let's see, other than Clinton, have any first ladies gone into politics? That's a good question. Not that I'm aware of, at least not at the federal level. But if somebody feel free to do a quick Google and prove me wrong. But not that I'm aware of. Okay.
Oh,
Let me see.
it's about keeping records versus being paid.
Paul's Pepper.
Use
Nixon
them.
got paid $18 million for his record. I thought it was. Who is right? So when President Nixon was in office, the Presidential Records Act was not passed yet. That was passed by Congress and signed by Jimmy Carter. And the interesting thing is Jimmy Carter did not have to abide by it. It was going to take effect after his first term in office. However, Jimmy Carter voluntarily agreed to abide by it and did provide all of his presidential papers and anything connected to his administration to the National Archives. So Nixon had a different set of laws to abide by. He didn't have that law to abide by, nor did any other president before that. And we thought that that was necessary to maintain our history. Because before that, again, presidential papers could be sold, they could be destroyed, they could just not be kept up, cared for. So this brought some clarity to that. I think it was a big boost for a nation's record keeping for our history so that all of us can now access these documents and learn about what our government was doing in those respective years. It's not always perfect. There is such a thing as classified documents, top secret documents. We tend to see those be unclassified as time goes by, but typically there's a 15 to 20-year period for some of the more complex, controversial things. And sometimes it's not even that they're controversial, it's that they just might be having an impact on the current administration in office. And that we just don't think it's in our nation's national security interest to make them public yet. But typically, we see the majority of things become available to the public 15 to 20 years after a president's left office. A lot of Carter stuff was coming out in the late 90s, let's say. So right now we're starting to see a lot of Clinton and George W. Bush documents, more of those coming to light as time has passed and gone on. But great question there, Miles. Thanks for putting that out there.
Well, it looks like we're just about at time, so
Good
it's a
timing.
great place to wrap up. I'm glad we can answer that one. So thank you to everyone who joined today, and thank you so much to Josh for your expertise and your time with this program. And I hope to see everyone at future PPSP programs, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for participating and being really active in the chat there. I really appreciate that. It's fun when I don't just lecture all day. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.